Welcome to a real cult classic where we talk about, well, your favorite cult classics. A little bit of pop culture, a smattering of old Hollywood gossip with a side of scandal and intrigue. I'm your esteemed cult leader, Megs, from the Cult of Megs, and this is my friend, your friend, cult elder, Auntie Amy. Amy, say hi to the cult.
Hello, friends.
It's October, so every week we're covering something spooky. So, viewer beware.
You're in for a scare.
This week, Amy and I have decided to handle two cases, one from BC and one from Ontario, since that's where we are from, respectively. Before we get into these cases, though, I just want to give everybody a heads up that we will be talking about people who have been harmed. In my case, I am talking about a case of murders in Vancouver from the early 80s, late 80s. And so I'm going to be discussing people's lives being taken, people being harmed, abuse, drug use, as well as sex work. So if you're around little ears or are sensitive to these topics, then you might want to skip this one. Amy, did that cover everything that's in yours this week?
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I will start. So, when we talked about cold cases that we wanted to cover, I chose this particular case because growing up in Northern Ontario in the late 90s, I would see Melanie Ethier's missing billboard on the Trans-Canada Highway every time my family drove out of town, mainly towards North Bay and Toronto. And the sad thing is the billboard is still there just outside of Temagami because the case has not been solved. It's been 28 years since Melanie disappeared in 1996. And, seeing that billboard year after year as a young person, I just remember thinking that Melanie was so beautiful and so young and that it was so sad. And it has always stuck with me. Um, and so when looking this up, I found that there are quite a bit of investigative pieces about Melanie that have surfaced in the past couple of years, which is fantastic because, prior to the rise of social media, I had not heard of anything growing up. There were no updates for me about Melanie. So reading articles about her with, videos. Like I just read one on the CTV's website that was published last month. And there are YouTube videos about the case and podcasts, including one that I listened to called The Next Call with David Ridgen from CBC. Now, I strongly suggest that you take a listen to that if you're interested in learning more about Melanie's case, because again, it has not been solved. So they are still actively looking for tips um, about it. Now, this podcast has 5 episodes and it's season 1 of the podcast. We'll leave a link to it in the description box because I'll be referencing it here as I tell you about Melanie's case. So, the driving force behind all of this is, of course, Melanie's mother, Celine, who is intent on learning the truth about her daughter's disappearance. And she has said in various interviews that she believes she's passed away, that Melanie has passed away, that she doesn't hold out hope that she'll be alive, but she wants closure and she wants to give her daughter a proper funeral and she wants the truth. And I cannot imagine living without that for 28 years. So, a little bit about Melanie. So, Melanie was born on December 25th, 1980, to Celine Etier. So, as a disclaimer, I'm going to be speaking about Celine as the primary parental figure in Melanie's life, but that does not mean that Melanie did not obviously have a father. Now, Celine talked about Melanie's father in the podcast, and she said that she met Melanie's father while he was studying mining at a school in Haileybury, Ontario, which is now known as the City of Temiskaming Shores. Now, Haileybury and New Liskeard, where Melanie's story takes place, and the township of Diamond all amalgamated in 2004 to create the city of Temiskaming Shores. Now, I will be referring to the setting here as New Liskeard because that is what it was called when this was all happening, and just for clarity. Anyway, after Celine was pregnant, Melanie's father ended up being sent to a different college, and then he had to go back to Botswana. So Celine in the podcast said they didn't leave on bad terms and they kept in touch, but Celine was a single mom in New Liskeard, where Melanie would grow up. I just because we're going to be talking about this case, and I just don't want people to think that Melanie's father was there because he wasn't. So long before the tragic case associated with her name, Melanie Ethier stood out. She was a young Black woman of mixed African and French Canadian heritage in a small, predominantly white town. Now, Melanie didn't suffer any overt forms of discrimination, according to Celine. She basically painted a picture of a good and happy childhood and adolescence for Melanie. And Melanie was universally described as bubbly, kind, and social with a great friend group. And by the time Melanie was 15, she worked at the daycare attached to her high school and looked after her younger sister, Jessie. She was younger by about 10 years, and they adored each other. But all of this would sadly come to an end on September 29th, 1996, when Melanie disappeared without a trace. So I'm going to talk you through the night of Melanie's disappearance and the day before. So the day before Melanie's disappearance on September 28th, 1996, she went out to pick up a gift for her grandmother's birthday. Melanie met up with her best friend, whose name is not publicly revealed for reasons that are specific to the person. We want to respect that, so we'll call her Kate. Kate had been doing homework in the New Liskeard library. She went outside and noticed Melanie getting off the bus, so Kate ditched her homework and went to hang out with Melanie. It was a normal day for the two of them. They shopped and went to Pizza for lunch, where Melanie shared that she wanted to become a teacher after graduation and go volunteering in Botswana. Later, Kate and Melanie met up with a group of their male friends, Dave Bromley, Ryan Chatwin, Jay Denham, and Melanie's newish boyfriend, Neil Fortier. They hung out at Mike Walton's video store close to where Melanie lived, and that's the actual name of the video store. They rented a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie called Sudden Death, which is eerie, and ended up at Melanie's home. But when Melanie asked her mom, Celine, if they could watch the movie there, Celine said no because there wasn't much room. They were in a small place. Melanie then asked if they could go to her bedroom instead, but Celine said no again because it was a mess. So Celine said that Melanie was in good spirits and ushered her friends out of the house to continue their quest to find a place to watch their movie. When they left, it was about 10 p.m. Now, they ended up trying to watch it at another female friend's house. Her name was Samia, but they couldn't do it there either. So Samia took her dog out to walk them part way to their next location. And something strange that truthfully nothing ever came out of this, but I think it's worth mentioning. But Samia said that while she was walking home, a white van stopped her. And her dog, who she was walking at the time and was big, was barking kind of madly at these two men in the van as they asked her for directions. And Samia said her dog barked too much and she was really scared and she backed up and didn't end up giving them directions and just went home. And this happened about 100 meters from Melanie's house. And Samia said she never saw the men or the van again. And she did tell this fact to the police, but like I said, nothing ever came of it. But again, very strange because it's a small town, everybody knows each other, etc. So the friend group ultimately made their way to Ryan Chatwin's place to watch the movie sometime after 10 p.m. Ryan's parents were home, but they were in their bedroom while the group were in the basement. It was a chill night and they were quiet. There was no drinking or drugs involved. They were just literally eating Joe Louis and watching the movie. Like it was just very innocent and sweet. So Dave left first. He didn't even actually go in to watch the film because he had a fender bender the night previously and wasn't allowed to be out. Jay, who was respecting a curfew his parents set out, left next at around midnight. And Kate, Melanie's best friend, stayed for a few hours, but admitted that she really didn't like the film, so she left about halfway through. Now, Kate was catching a ride home at around 1 a.m., and she was going to be picked up from Melanie's house, so she had to walk there, which would have been about a 15-20 minute walk. Now, Melanie stayed behind. She still wanted to watch the movie. As Kate was walking towards an intersection, she noticed a car coming towards her from the right. It made her nervous because it was driving quite slowly. She crossed the intersection and the car kept approaching her very, very slowly. By the time she made it through the intersection, it was close behind her, so she ended up running to Melanie's house. Kate said it was a white car, not in the best condition, with a patch of gray on the side, with two males sitting inside. Two more males again. She made it to Melanie's home and got picked up and went to bed. The next morning, September 29th, Melanie's mother woke up to Melanie's alarm. It was 6 a.m., and Melanie usually went to work at a daycare, so she just had it set at that time. Celine went to turn it off and noticed that Melanie wasn't home. She didn't think anything of it at that point, and she just went back to bed thinking, oh, she'll be there later because, she had to make her grandmother's birthday cake. The grandmother and grandfather were set to arrive in the morning to eat the cake before they were leaving town. Like that's a plan they had made. So she knew her daughter knew that, and she wasn't too worried. Now, there's a complication here. So Celine's house phone, had been cut off the previous day and would be cut off for the weekend because she missed out on paying her phone bill. She planned to pay it on Monday, but because there was no phone, she didn't think it was weird that Melanie hadn't called to give her a heads up either. So there were a couple things playing in to just sort of, I don't know, just make it not as weird as it would have normally been. And Celine in the podcast had sort of mentioned that Melanie had also fallen asleep watching movies at friends' places before. And you have to remember, this is a small town. A lot of them in the podcast talk about how it really felt safe. Celine went back to sleep after turning off the alarm and woke up between 8 and 9 a.m. She saw that Melanie still wasn't back. And at this point, her parents, which were Melanie's grandparents, arrived and they kind of were concerned immediately. Now, Celine was driven by her dad to Tim Hortons so she could buy a cake and use their phone. She called Kate, Melanie's best friend, and Kate said that Melanie should be home. She didn't know why she wouldn't be home. And she'd call Ryan's house to see what happened. So when Kate called, she discovered that Melanie had left around 1:30 a.m. Neither Ryan nor her boyfriend, Neil, walked her home. So she left alone at 1:30 in the morning. And she would have taken, it's important to note, a similar route to Kate, right? Because she was going to her home that Kate went earlier. And we know that there were those like strange occurrences that happened to both Samia and Kate. Now, Kate told Celine, and Celine called the police straight away. Not long after that, firemen and policemen were looking under the bridge where Melanie would have crossed to get home. And this is the beginning of the mystery that is yet to be solved. What happened to Melanie? So, Rob Matthews is an inspector with the OPP, and he's the senior officer on Melanie's case, and Corey Betts is currently the lead detective. Now, over the years, they have received various tips through Crime Stoppers, but amazingly, they received their first tip about a bridge sighting 12 years after Melanie disappeared. And here's how that went. So a woman called and she went to the police and said that her husband was driving back from a wedding. And apparently there were 3 weddings that weekend in and around New Liskeard. She went on the bridge and remembers seeing a young woman. She said to her husband, I didn't know we had young Black girls living in New Liskeard. She thought she was pretty young to be out at night. She realized it was Melanie after seeing a missing poster. Now, this woman claims she saw Melanie at 1:30 a.m., but based on when the movie Sudden Death finished and when Melanie left, it would have had her on the bridge closer to 1:50 or 2:10. Now, this woman also remembered that Melanie was wearing jeans, which was what Melanie was wearing. So this is considered a very credible witness statement and tip, and that's probably the most credible one that they've received, or at least that they were saying in the podcast that they've received. There were a few other ones. One woman, again, a lot of the tips were like recent, like a couple, like 2008, 2012. And I always find that really interesting. Like, why are people remembering things so much later, or they're choosing to reveal it so much later? There was one woman who said she was up late doing homework and she heard a woman screaming outside her house and then three shadows following her. But that would be in direct conflict with this testimony, which is really credible, right? So, bunch of stuff like that. But based on his investigative experience, Rob Matthews believes there's a strong indication that whoever was responsible for Melanie's disappearance was probably someone local, or at least someone who knew the area, rather than a truck driver passing through, because this would have produced more tips, right? Like it would have been more likely that people would have seen a transport truck. But that was another theory, a trucker driving by, a hit and run, and somebody taking the body because they freaked out that they had, maybe killed Melanie when they were driving. There were just tons of theories. But this particular notation of Rob Matthews, that it was somebody local, fits into something that the podcast covered. Celine brings up the name of someone who she admits she has suspected has had involvement in Melanie's disappearance for a while. That person was her best friend's husband, Dennis LeVay. And he's who I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of this, because the stories and facts that the podcast uncovers about this man and the connections to Melanie's case are undeniable. So I'm going to take you through it. And just as a disclaimer, Dennis has since passed away. So why does Celine suspect Dennis? Well, she brings up a memory. About 3 days after Melanie's disappearance, it was suggested to her that she see a psychic, one that works with the police, apparently. And she was just saying at that time she would have accepted anything. She was desperate. So she went, but her car was broken. So Dennis drove her. She said on the way, he was extremely nervous and he was breathing really heavily. And he made a comment to her. He said, whoever did this is going to have scratches like this on their arms because Melanie is very strong. And he rolled up his sleeve and showed Celine fresh fingernail scratches up his arm that he claims Melanie gave him when they were play fighting the day before she disappeared. They were fingernail scratches and they were fresh. Now, Celine clocked this as very odd. And she did tell the police, by the way. So we need to dive into this. Your face, Megan. I know. This was my
What?
face.
What
When
is
I heard
happening?
this, I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? So again, he was incredibly nervous and he showed her fresh fingernail scratches on his arm that he admitted Melanie gave him, but he said by play fighting. Okay. Here's some background on Dennis. In the podcast, Sylvie, his wife of many years and Celine's best friend, is interviewed by David, the host of the podcast, and she gets into his backstory and also their relationship and what she remembers of his time with Melanie, etc. So on June 17th, 1990, Dennis was in a car accident with a girl who was driving while impaired. Now, Dennis suffered injuries and was awarded over $600,000 in a civil suit in 93. He was 29 at the time of the accident. And this is significant because he had to take medication all the time because of the pain he had as a result of the accident. Sylvie talked about the fact that his back had to be fused and he had a brace and had trouble walking. He started taking OxyContin for the pain and lost his settlement money in a failed investment scheme. So despite his pain, but because he lost his money, he had to return to doing heavy drilling as a driller in the mining industry. So she said he went to the Northwest Territories and Mongolia and traveled sort of all over the world to make the most amount of money that he could. So he'd be gone for like months at a time. That was very normal. But he'd have to medicate quite heavily because that's a very physical job, as you can imagine. Now, Melanie was the same age as Sylvie's son, Dennis's stepson, Jason. So they were like really good friends and they grew up together. Celine brought her and her sister Jessie over to Sylvie's very often. And Sylvie said that Melanie took to Dennis as like a dad figure. Now, apparently, on the day of Melanie's disappearance, Dennis and his stepson and his stepson's friend Joel packed up to go fishing. That was his alibi. He went fishing. Now, Dennis returned to their house on the Sunday Melanie disappeared after his fishing trip. He came in around 4 p.m. Sylvie told him about Melanie right away, and he immediately told Sylvie, whoever took Melanie will have scratches like me because she's very strong. And he showed Sylvie those scratch marks made by fingernails down his arm, and they were fresh. Now, remember, he was fishing. And even though Melanie saw Sylvie the day before she disappeared, Dennis wasn't home. So, how could he have received those claw marks even from play fighting? It doesn't make sense. So, he would tell Sylvie, again, whoever did this, like Melanie would do this to them because he's very strong, which Sylvie then, in retrospect, went, it was very strange. But he kept saying this to people, like very, anyway, I'm going to go into some stuff here now. Keep that in mind, by the way. So, Dennis had a criminal record. Sylvie described Dennis going to jail because he tried stuff with younger girls. So here are his records. In 2006, he failed to comply with an order not to communicate or associate with several people. In 2012, he uttered death threats, assault with a motor vehicle, possession of a taser, and various probation violations. In 2013, sexual interference, touching a person under the age of 13 for a sexual purpose. And in the podcast, Sylvie explains that her daughter, Stephanie, who she had with Dennis, Stephanie told her about a time that she had her best friend over, and Dennis talked to her friend in their sunroom about orgasms and asked if she ever had one and said he'd like to help her experience one. Now, Sylvie, at this point in the podcast, breaks down crying because as she's explaining this, she said she's now hearing all these different stories about him, and she's clearly reconciling with the fact that she knew one version of this man and another version, a terrible version, also existed. And she admits that she clearly has doubts that he's innocent, and she also wouldn't be surprised if he had involvement in Melanie's case. And remember, Melanie was like a daughter to her. She loved Melanie. But yeah, so then the podcast goes on to interview the daughter, his daughter. And like her mother, Stephanie believes it makes sense that her father was involved because he had demons. And she talked about the extensive sort of ways in which he tried to engage with her teenage friends in a sexual way, starting when she was 14. And remember, Melanie disappeared when she was 15. So he was charged twice for trying to have sex with her friends. One case, he tried to sexually assault Stephanie's friend while she was in their house and Steph and her mom were sleeping. He got acquitted because he had a good lawyer. In 2014, he had a repeat offense. He pled guilty and went to jail for 15 months. While he was in jail, Celine went to visit him and she described it as having this gut feeling and she needed to cross him off the list of suspects in her mind. And she went there and she asked him point blank, did you have something to do with Melanie's murder or disappearance? And he denied it and said like he could never do that. And he said, oh, it's probably like this person. And he gave her a name. So when he got out, Celine had seen him in town and she went to her friend Sylvie and said, "Hey, give Dennis my phone number. I'm going to call him, or tell him to call me because I want to talk to him about this," because she wanted to have a further discussion. And she said, "If he doesn't call me, I'm going to show up." Sylvie delivers this message. Stephanie remembers this day because he asked her to have a cigarette with him outside. So they did. And Steph said that he was really, really fidgety, antsy, and was looking like ill, like grayish and sweating. And she asked him, like, what was wrong? And he said, "Celine wants to talk to me." And he said, "And I'm going to have to talk to the police about Melanie." So he asked Stephanie to go with him and to talk for him. And she said, "I can't do that because they want to talk to you directly." And he said that it wasn't making him feel good. So Stephanie said, "Why? I mean, you have an alibi. There's nothing to worry about. You were fishing." And he said, "No, we weren't." And now this is years, years later. Stephanie's whole life, he had stuck to that story. He looked down at his feet. He said, "No, we were in North Bay at a motocross competition." North Bay is about a 2-hour drive from New Liskeard, by the way. So he told her he had to take he had taken his Aunt Sherry's car. And Stephanie thought this was weird because it would make more sense if he was going to an event like that to take his truck to be able to haul any kind of equipment he'd have, right? So that was the last conversation she had with him because 4 hours later, he had a massive stroke, which I'm assuming is from the stress of that potential encounter with the mom, right? So after the stroke, Dennis couldn't speak. He died 2 weeks later on January 8th, 2016. He was 51. And Celine did go to the hospital to try to talk to him, but she couldn't get anything out of him. Now, here's some other details that Stephanie recalled, which I think are important. So he also told his daughter after a work stint in Mongolia, where he used a lot of cocaine because he ran out of his pain medication, that he had a dream where he killed Melanie and it really bothered him and he couldn't stop throwing up. And she said it messed with him for a long time. Here's another thing. After his death, the family got his medical files and listed there was split personality, which Stephanie and her mother never knew he had been diagnosed with officially. And she said it explained a lot and that he was never treated for it. And in terms of explaining, Stephanie described one time she went to have a smoke with her dad because they were both smokers and they started having a conversation about life and having a great time. And then she noted that his face completely changed and she sensed a bad energy from him. So she said, "Dad, you really want to hurt me right now, don't you?" And she said he started crying and apologizing and said he didn't know why he did. So, you know, there's just a lot of stuff here. The motocross event Dennis referenced as his new alibi couldn't be substantiated by the CBC podcast host David Ridgen, by the way. So that also didn't really check out. Now, a couple of other things. Jocelyn, who was the sister of Lionel, Dennis's best friend, talks about how a few days after Melanie went missing, Dennis showed up at Jocelyn's mother-in-law's house where she was to ask about Lionel. He wanted his German Shepherd to look for Melanie. Jocelyn said he seemed out of sorts. She saw the scratches on his body, right? When he lifted his arm up. I think he didn't show her, but he lifted his arm up and his t-shirt shifted and she saw them and she was like, "Whoa, where did you get those?" And he said, "Oh, I got them from branches while I was out looking for Melanie." So, major discrepancy. He's telling Celine, Sylvie, everybody about this play fighting, and now he's saying, "Oh, I got them from branches," which is a big, like, red flag. And Jocelyn admitted she had a really weird feeling. And this is a frustrating thing. When the podcaster asked if she went to the police with this info, she said no. Because she went, it was a weird feeling, but I never in a million years would connect it like, oh, he did something, right? So Lionel, Dennis's best friend, talked about his relationship with Dennis, and he said that they, in fact, had not spoken a few years before Dennis passed away. Lionel describes like the last encounter they had was when he kicked him out of his house because he was so high. And even like stuff like when Dennis was in jail, he lied to Lionel about that, saying he was going to his dad's farm in Alberta. So Lionel didn't even know he was in jail for those 15 months. And he said that although Dennis never spoke about Melanie, he remembers that one night he said something in regards to Melanie and another girl and said they'll never find them when he was high. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Jessie, Melanie's younger sister, also said that Dennis tried to sleep with her when she was 15 years old. And at that point, Jessie said that she cut ties with the family completely after that. And that is when she made the connection to Melanie and Dennis because she realized that he had been a predator towards girls Melanie's age specifically, and now she could include herself in that age bracket. So you're getting all of this, and you're like, that's so much already. Here are a few more things that will blow your mind. So even though the police said they investigated Dennis, Stephanie said police only spoke to her for the first time a week before David Ridgen, who created the podcast, reached out to her. And that podcast came out in 2021. She also said they never spoke to Dennis. Sylvie also said they never spoke to Dennis. So years ago, a wooden memorial at the back of the North Cobalt Cemetery with the words "Rest in Peace, Melanie Ethier" was found by a couple. They immediately called the police, and Celine was notified about its existence. Now, she believes, or believed at least, that Melanie's body is where that wooden memorial is. She took it as a sign. Now, this is significant and relates to Dennis because Dennis used to work in that graveyard and drove an ATV around it. The cemetery is also a couple of blocks away from where Dennis used to live. But the cadaver dogs came and searched the area and did not find any signs of Melanie's body. But here's the kicker. An old friend of Dennis and his wife told Celine, okay, they had a property that was like nearish the graveyard, I think like in a place that Dennis had frequented because when she talked about the cadaver dogs and the cemetery, she was like, I want these dogs to look at another area that he used to go, and his friends have a house there and he would frequent and like hang out with them. So she called those friends and asked if like she could talk to them. And they basically said, we have to tell you something. So she called David, who created the podcast, and he drove down to New Liskeard to be with her while she went to their house to receive this information because it was something they wanted to do in person. Basically, they told a story of Dennis before he died going to their house, and he was very, very like under the influence, as he usually was. And he admitted to killing Melanie. And he said he didn't mean to, it went wrong, but that he killed her. They asked where he put Melanie's body, but he refused to respond. And he then started to say some really crude sexual things to the woman in the friendship. And she kicked him out and was like, get out of here, never come back. Basically, like, you're disgusting. And also, you've admitted to murdering this girl. Now, remember, he died in 2016. So they knew this information for years. And only because Celine called did they tell her. And I know that the day after he admitted that, he went back to their place and he just basically said, "Oh, I was drunk and I didn't mean anything I said," and basically threatened the woman that if she told anybody, he'd get her. So, they didn't feel safe. He did die in 2016. She never spoke to him again before that, and he never returned to the property, but she told Celine again under those circumstances. Um, but yeah, so it is technically still a cold case. I feel like there's so much driving us to a specific person that there are like very credible reasons to believe that he would have been involved. I don't know. What do you think, Megan?
The wooden, what did you like the what did you call it?
Like the
The
memorial?
memorial creeped me out.
Yeah.
Because why
Yeah.
would that be there? And when you said about the cadaver dogs, the thing is that depending on how long she had been there, I mean, it's a graveyard.
Yeah.
It's a graveyard. So how accurate are cadaver dogs in a graveyard, especially if there's been a body that's quite decomposed, is my question.
Yeah. And it could have been carved out of guilt and the body is not there, but it
Mhm.
is like a sign of something.
He
But
did it.
I mean, he confessed to
He
it.
did it. Yeah, he did it.
And it's just so enraging that he had so many opportunities to come clean and to give Celine
Closure.
closure and peace. And he didn't for what? Like, I mean, again, the investigation is still open. The police have apparently explored him as an option. And I don't understand. It seems like the scratches alone to me.
And his obsession with it. Like he obviously was obsessed with it. He was obsessed with the case. He was obsessed with her. There's a
Yes.
reason for it.
Yeah. So that was really disturbing and very, very hard to read through and listen to all the accounts of harm that he committed. And just to know that he ultimately, apart from spending 15 months in jail, went unchecked. Like he
I know
just
that pattern
was,
of behavior,
yeah,
even that just disgusting. And the fact that nobody knew about it. Like I'm surprised that he wasn't registered.
yeah. Well, I don't,
Like
this is the
there's so many
thing.
things.
There's
Yeah.
so many things about this that I just want to keep reading, and I'm sure there's more that's going to come out, but he really terrorized some of those younger girls in that community and like listening to their voices explain this like
Hmm.
it's absolutely horrific. So and there are like whisperings about, his potential connection to other missing women in the areas. It's not substantiated, but you kind of think, right? He also said some really disgusting things about his time in other places when he was working in the mining community and how he would engage with women and girls in those communities. And I'm just like, I'm not gonna say them because it's truly
Creep.
horrifying. But like, yeah, he was a deviant, a predator, a really, you know, a horrible person. I will say to close this that he had a brother that was part of that alibi. He was a motocross like person. He like participated in the sport and he was apparently there with him that weekend along with his stepson and his stepson's friend Joel. His stepson and his friend don't remember being there, like they're not able to substantiate that alibi, but his brother Andre was contacted repeatedly to contribute to the story and to just clear things up and to um, give any kind of closure or truth to the situation, or even just to say, "Hey, yeah, we were in North Bay that weekend that Melanie disappeared." He refuses to speak about it. So, and he's still alive.
The admissions of guilt are just everywhere.
I don't know. He just will not participate in this
That's
conversation.
weird.
And it is strange. And it's also just like if you can offer any, like, why wouldn't you?
But also, like, if you could exonerate your sibling, why wouldn't you do that?
He claims he doesn't know anything. And I know that the podcast like in the podcast, they David talked about his responses like by text, and they were pretty foul. So he was very aggressively telling him basically, leave me alone. So yeah, so there is a possibility for there to be complete closure, for this case to be closed. I know that Celine is like very much still hoping for that, and I wish so much that she gets it, but it is still open. So if you're listening to this and you know this case, or you know someone who might know someone, please, it's active, so you can offer any help. That would be great.
Well, let's keep this joy train going, Amy, and let's talk about some Vancouver murders, shall we? As we both know, Amy, Vancouver's downtown east side is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. It is transient and is often a place where the city's most vulnerable seek support within their own community. It's also a place where many young women, those Indigenous, and those working in the sex trade have gone missing without notice for decades. At least until the summer of 1998, when the VPD and the DTES community realized that a good chunk of young women had vanished and that maybe they should look into it. It was that realization that led them to the Picton farm, but it also displayed the immense vulnerabilities the DTES community faces. The fact that it is so transient that there's no way to really track the members of the community, especially those that travel from out of province. That there are numerous young women working in the sex trade, and that many of them are Indigenous, to groups that are notoriously ignored and thought to be expendable. It's what makes the DTES the perfect hunting ground for those looking to do harm. And so it is not surprising that Willie Picton was not the first to prey on the city's most vulnerable. Between April 1988 and August 1990, 6 bodies were found scattered across the city. Rose Minnie Peters was the first to be found. Born in 1959, Rose was a 28-year-old Indigenous woman from Port Alberni. When she was 18, she had been shot in the neck by a police bullet when she got too close to a botched robbery. The incident left her partially paralyzed, and she walked with a slight limp. She had moved to the downtown east side after being released from the hospital. It was upon her arrival in the lower mainland that she got hooked on the drug Talwayne, which is an addictive prescription drug that was used as a heroin substitute. She had 2 sons, both were in foster care. She leveraged sex work to support herself. Rose had been found in a laneway behind the 4900 block of St. Catharines on Easter Sunday, 1988. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The second woman found was 21-year-old Lisa Gavin. Lisa's start to life had been rough. She was born in a prison hospital addicted to heroin. Her mother had been both a dealer and a user. Lisa was placed with the Turlings, a family of 6 who lived on a farm in Richmond when she was only a few months old. She was loved by her older siblings. They said she was a funny kid who loved growing up on the farm with all their animals, especially the horses. She lived with the Turlings until her 9th birthday, when the Ministry of Social Services decided to place her back with her biological mother after she had finished her latest drug trafficking sentence. Not only was Lisa placed back with a woman who had been in and out of jail for years due to drug use, but Lisa's brother Jerry was one of the leaders of the Clark Park Gang, one of the notorious park gangs of the 60s and 70s that terrorized the city and were at the heart of the Chuck Berry and Rolling Stone riots. Lisa was quickly swept up into the lives of her family, and by her early teens was actively using. She would still return to the Richmond farm looking to clean up her life. The Turlings always let her know that she could come home. Lisa had been working as a sex worker to support her addiction and had gone out one night to get enough money to buy cocaine. Her sister Sharon had seen her on the corner of Main and Hastings while she had been out picking up her husband from work. It wasn't Lisa's usual corner. She usually hung out around East Broadway and Prince Albert Street. Sharon circled back to pick her little sister up, but by the time she got back to the corner, Lisa was gone. Her body was found in a lane behind Knight Street and East 49th on August 13th, 1988. 6 weeks after Lisa was found, there was a third body. It was that of Lisa's best friend, 25-year-old Glenna Sallin. Glenna was an Indigenous woman from High Prairie, Alberta, and would frequent the Broadway Strip, where she lived and worked. Like Lisa, Glenna had been working in the sex trade and had an addiction to cocaine. She would often stay with Lisa and another friend, Tracy Chartrand. Her friends called her Dusty. She was only tiny, 5'2" and 92 pounds. Glenna was found on September 30th, 1988, behind a house on West 24th Avenue in the weeds after being beaten and strangled. She left behind a 4-month-old daughter who was living with her mother in Alberta. 25-year-old Tracy Lee Chartrand went missing shortly after her friends, Lisa and Glenna, had been found. She was last seen in October of 1988, and police knew that she was heavily tied to her friends. They were always together, staying with each other at the same places. Tracy had grown up in North Vancouver. She had been married and had a son, but she was also addicted to cocaine and worked in the sex trade to support her habit, like her friends, Lisa and Glenna. Tracy was found 6 months after she went missing in a shallow grave on the UBC endowment lands. At her funeral, it was said that she was a person of such beauty and intelligence that she marched to the beat of her own drummer and had for a long time. 33-year-old Frances Annie Grant was the 5th woman found. Annie also grew up in North Vancouver, specifically Lynn Valley. She had a twin brother named Jamie, and they had been adopted together by the Wright family. Annie had married a man named Ron, but at some point had begun using cocaine, which led to her working in the sex trade. While she had been off the streets for a year, she had returned and was working the same strip as Lisa, Glenna, and Tracy. She was found on June 4th, 1989, in a shed behind a rooming house in Mount Pleasant without her clothes. While the other 3 women had clearly been murdered, the pathologist labeled Annie's death as undetermined. There was bruising around her neck, which indicated a degree of strangulation, but she also had levels of cocaine in her system, high enough to cause an overdose. While the Crown had difficulty accepting it as a murder, the police did not. 19-year-old Karen Taylor had been out with her friends at the Cecil Hotel on the Granville Strip when she left with a friend to get pizza. At some point, Karen was offered a decent sum of money from a man to leave with him, and that was the last time she was ever seen alive. Originally from Ontario, Karen did occasionally dabble in sex work, but unlike the other woman, was not known to use. She was found on August 24th, 1990, in a Shaughnessy Lane in nothing but her costume jewelry. While police had connected the dots between Lisa, Glenna, and Tracy, it wasn't until Annie was found that they had any leads. There was a low-level drug dealer and user who lived in the rooming house that the shed was behind. They put him at the top of the list, but due to the lack of connection between Rose and Karen, they knew he might not be their only suspect. And that's where he sat until 2007, when the Alley murder cases were given another look under the Project ELE. Under the new project, investigators were looking to build a DNA profile using cast-off DNA. They found out that their main suspect wasn't in the best of health and happened to be located at Vancouver General Hospital. They watched him until he went to the smoking pit, where they were able to nab a discarded cigarette butt and a drink container from him. And wouldn't you know it, it turned out that his DNA matched the DNA evidence they had linked to the murders of Lisa and Glenna. They arrested him and interviewed him, but nothing came of the interview. So they released him and took the evidence to the Crown, thinking that they had a solid case for charging him with the murders. But the Crown said, nope, we want a confession. They also refused to hold him accountable for Annie's murder, despite his proximity to the shed where she was found, due to the fact that her death was undetermined. Unfortunately, their suspect died during that time. The Crown took twiddling their thumbs. Regardless of the Crown's decision not to charge their number 1 suspect, who had been linked to 2 murders via DNA, investigators are confident that he was responsible for Lisa, Glenna, and Annie's deaths. They also believe he was responsible for Tracy's due to the timing of her disappearance in relation to the other murders, but because she was found so long after her death, any available DNA evidence was decomposed. As for Rose, her niece said that she had spoken to a detective who had been part of the Missing Indigenous Women program that was looking to give closure to families of missing Indigenous women. She had told the detective about her aunt, and he said that they had been working on her case for 10 years, and that she was part of Project Alley, which they were calling Project the Alley Murders. That they had a suspect that they had been following for some time, and that they had gotten his DNA from a cup or a cigarette butt that he had thrown out. The detective said that when they had called him in for questioning, that he had a fanny pack on him, and that while they had left him alone in the room, he had cut his own throat. He survived. They wanted to take him to the dentist to get dental molds made because Rose had bite marks all over her body. But during the time it took to get him there, Amy, he had pulled out all of his teeth so they couldn't get the imprints.
No, don't tell me that.
But I mean, he already looked pretty guilty since he attempted to end his life during questioning and then pulled out all his teeth. So he didn't have to get dental molds. And the cigarette butts, he had to have been the same guy that the police had arrested, that they had arrested that died. Anyway, in 2022, the VPD added Glenna Sowen and Lisa Gavin's cases to their list of cold cases that are available online. Anybody can access them. Lisa's sister Sharon was hoping that they were looking into her murder, but investigators were confused. The police knew who killed her, and the man had died in 2009. Now, I heavily relied on research that the incomparable Eve Lazarus did for the Alley murders, and she has a far more in depth podcast about the case. And when she asked the investigators why they wouldn't name the man who committed these atrocious acts, they said it was because they wanted the VPD to hold a press conference, talk about the evidence, and name the name. But instead, they've chosen to give the victims' families false hope that justice will be served when they could have given them closure over a decade ago.
I'm sensing similarities.
That's, yeah. When you were talking about yours, I was like, this sounds way too familiar. Why would you put them up on the cold case site looking
Oh
for
my
tips
gosh.
when you know who did it?
This is one of our more frustrating episodes, especially if you're a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, that is so sad.
I wanted to do this one because I think that I've been seeing a narrative online because we know that people feed off the negative about Hastings and the downtown east side and the people who live there and just the fact that they are human beings.
Yes.
They're human beings who have families, who have people who love them, that either have fallen onto hard times or have been given an absolutely crap deck of cards and don't know ways to cope, don't know ways to function, and end up in this life that's really hard to get out of. And then people take advantage of them and they harm them. And
Yeah.
it makes me sad that the humanity has been taken out of that area of town that desperately needs people to see them as human beings.
Well, and that area of town is I mean it's so complex and unless you are here, there's a lot of people who don't believe the extent of it, right? Like it is truly it's so sad and so complex. I mean, that's what I'll say about it.
I don't
It's
think
a
people
really
realize that it's a systemic issue too, and that it's been going on for decades, that it has to do with other provinces,
no, I know.
handing bus fare out and just, sending people our way, and we don't have the funding to support everybody. And it ends up that people like Robert Picton take advantage and use it as their own hunting ground. It's disgusting.
Oh God, that case is like that. I can't even. He passed away, right?
He was, I believe, murdered in prison,
Hmm.
which also there's a lot of stuff about that too, like all of it. Well, Amy, those two cases I think were quite a lot.
Yeah, they were, you know, taxing. So yeah, I
But I'm
just,
glad that I mean, I think as people have seen over the last few weeks, I believe in remembering victims and never forgetting people whose lives have been taken away from them. So I'm glad that we
absolutely,
could honor them tonight.
yeah, yep, yep. And the people still searching for answers and
Hopefully
you
they
know,
can find them.
yeah,
And that's the same way with your case as with my case. Obviously, there are people that believe that they know what happened, but nobody knows for certain. So if anybody, like Amy said, is out there listening who knows anything about either of these cases, please reach out to your local law enforcement and let them know.
yeah. Because even if you don't think that the information you know is important or valid or relevant, say it anyway, share it anyway. You don't know how something factors into a complex, decades long case.
Mm-hmm. So next week we will be back with some cults, though. So I'm sure that will bring as much levity as a cult can.
It's
Until
October.
then, we will be back next week with more terrifying tales. Stay safe,
Check your candy.
and may the cult
Be with you.